What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is American Literature. Now, this week we're going to be taking a look at a short story by Edgar Allan Poe called William Wilson. And in order to get the most out of this text, we're basically going to look at three things. We're going to look at a little bit of the author's background, a few specific literary elements from this text, and of course, as always, we're going to finish by taking a look at a few big ideas that are going to serve as a lens through which we view this story. Edgar Poe lived from 1809 to 1849, and as you'll very quickly see, basically the entirety of his life was a series of tragedies and traumatic events leading up to an early death. Very little of his history was good, happy. We get glimpses of it here and there, but for the most part, things were not great for little Edgar. Edgar Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 19th, 1809, to two actor parents. His father, David Poe, abandoned the family shortly thereafter in 1810, and then not too long after that, his mother, Elizabeth Poe, died of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, or the Red Death, is a disease that can affect the lungs. Now, very, very few people ever get sick from this nowadays, but back in Poe's time, death was fairly common. In fact, 1 out of every 4 deaths was attributed to tuberculosis. Now, they often called it consumption because the victim would kind of wither away, it would get thin and frail, and usually by the time it got serious, they would begin to cough up blood. So this is a nasty, nasty thing. After the death of Edgar Poe's parents, he was taken in by John and Frances Allan. Now, John Allan was a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia, who dealt in a variety of goods, including cloth, wheat, tombstones, tobacco, and even human slaves. And just to be clear, just in case it's not completely obvious, that's bad. Now, John Allan would go back and forth between spoiling Poe and, as one of my sources puts it, aggressively disciplining him. Now, I think it would be fair to interpret that as abuse, because it's not uncommon for abusers to use gifts as a way to maintain control over the abused. During his teenage years, Edgar Poe lived a privileged life among the elite, but the family never formally adopted Poe, which was always a source of tension between him and his adopted father. Eventually, he did take the family name Allan as his middle name, thus becoming Edgar Allan Poe. At 17 years old in 1826, he went to the University of Virginia, and his father did not give him enough money for tuition, so he tried to gamble to make up the difference. He started with $110 and ended up with $2,000 in debt from gambling. Stay with that for a second. This man lost over $2,000 in 1800s money. That's not good. Shortly thereafter, he dropped out of university altogether. And by this time, Poe had a really tense and an unhealthy relationship with John Allan. So he didn't actually return home to live with the Allans. Instead, in 1827, Poe joined the army, and for a while did quite well. In that 2-year span that he was in the army, he rose to the rank of sergeant major, which is the highest rank that a non-commissioned officer could attain. In 1830, he entered West Point Military Academy. And again, after about a year, he had run into some financial problems and purposefully got himself kicked out of the military academy. Now, at this time, Poe had done a bit of writing here and there, writing some short stories, a collection of poems. And after his brother's death in 1831, he began pursuing writing as a full-time career. And we'll talk a little bit more about Poe's life from here forward next week when we read another short story by Edgar Allan Poe. But let's focus on this week's reading, a short story called William Wilson. Now, William Wilson is, again, a short story, not a book, not a sermon, not a poem. It's a short story, and it was published in 1839. The setting for this story is largely inspired by Poe's childhood years in London. probably one of the few sets of good memories that Edgar Allan Poe has to look back on. And he takes this good memory and filters it through all of the darkness and despair of the rest of his life, and we get what is very much a dark story, akin to everything else that Poe is well known for. Now, a term that might be helpful to know for this story is the word doppelganger. A doppelganger is a look-alike or a double of a living person. Sometimes we see people that look like us in the real world, and that person is our doppelganger, someone who looks just like us. Now, as for the specifics of this story, this is a very subtle story. Clearly, Poe was very carefully crafting each sentence, making them very balanced with very, very few adjectives. You'll notice that the writing here is unique and just expertly crafted. There's very little concrete imagery here, which basically means that descriptions of the physical settings, the things that you can see, touch, hear, smell, there's very little description of those things, which casts a bit of a shadow of doubt over everything that we hear the narrator say in this story. We get a little bit of a description of the school, which may be the point at which the narrator is still coherently viewing the world around him. But after that, we get very, very little else to tell us what the place looks like and really help us sort out what is real and not in the story. And that leaves the reader to put the pieces together on their own, which is one of the greatest things about this story. Now, this story is a great example of dark romanticism. It's like regular romanticism, only darker. And of course, you've seen the 4 characteristics of American literary romanticism, but I'll remind you of those again here. We have individualism, which is where the individual is depicted as separate and often superior to the community. We have imagination, which is a feature of this era of literature where the imagination takes primary importance over the literary text. It's no longer elevating logic and reason. It's the imagination. It's wonder. It's beauty. It is theater of the mind. Then we have nature, which is seen as both a source of truth and beauty in this writing and culture at large, because of course we've talked about how the Industrial Revolution brought more and more people into these densely populated city centers, and they get less time out in nature. They begin to appreciate it more because they realize what they had left behind. And then lastly, we have the distant, which is a fascination of the Romanticists for faraway places and times. We've seen that in many of the stories that we've read in this unit, and it is something that is unique to this literary period. And of course, we'll finish with a couple of big ideas. Now, in this story, some things I want you to be thinking about as you're processing the events of this story, as you're making sense of what's happening. I want you to think about the main character, our narrator. He's experiencing paranoia. He's experiencing guilt. He's experiencing mental illness. And of course, we have to question in this story what is real and what is simply the perception of someone who just isn't well. I think you'll find this story pretty exciting, maybe even interesting. Maybe it'll spark some questions in your mind that we can get together and talk about very soon. Until next time, good luck, have fun. What a time to be alive.